Thank you. I have no inside knowledge of the D.C. plot, so I just want to throw out a couple thoughts and a couple themes that examine how we might conduct policy going forward, as well as how we might conduct analysis and put the plot in its proper perspective. There's been a great debate in Washington about whether this is a rogue operation, and this is constantly a theme within counter-terror analysis of Iran. Can we attribute blame to the Iranians or not? I want to address 2 points when it comes to so-called rogue operations in Iran. The first is it's important to understand the structure of the office of the Supreme Leader inside Iran. Iran is, no questions asked, a dictatorship. But it's not a dictatorship like North Korea, and it's not a dictatorship like Saddam Hussein's Iraq was. It's not a situation of the Supreme Leader simply giving an order and expecting it to be done. The way the Office of the Supreme Leader works is he has, according to some estimates, perhaps 2,000 commissars who are put in different levels of the bureaucracy, not only in the parliament and the ministries and the IRGC, but also in the governorships and any other bureaucracy which is there, who exist to understand what the debates are going on at that level in that bureaucracy. They stovepipe it up to the Office of the Supreme Leader, and whatever he thinks crosses a line, he shuts down. So in reality, he acts as a dictator by veto power, by only allowing certain parameters of action permissible parameters of action to be developed. The long and short of this is, however, that one will never find a smoking gun in the SIGINT or any other intelligence because the Supreme Leader won't give a direct order saying, I want this done. He will simply allow certain things to happen and shut down whatever he doesn't want to happen. And this goes back into other debates we've had in the past. For example, whether Iran had given an order to Hezbollah to start the 2006 war with Israel and so forth. There's no smoking gun there, but for anyone that follows Iran, that shouldn't be a surprise. There will never be a smoking gun. The Iranians thrive on this idea of plausible deniability. However, it's interesting when one looks at rogue operations in Iran, because oftentimes, in hindsight, one can have an indication about whether it was truly a rogue operation or not. And this goes into promotions. In 1989, there was an assassination in Vienna, Austria, in which a leading Kurdish dissident was killed. The person who conducted that, the gunman, fled back and was subsequently promoted to a brigadier general position in the Quds Force. He received a promotion. Likewise, as everyone here knows, the current Iranian defense minister was one of the planners of the 1994 Buenos Aires bombing. So certainly it seems that in hindsight, it's possible to see that certain actions weren't rogue actions because the perpetrators got promotions. The same thing is true, by the way, for Colonel Amanga, who led the 2007 episode with regard to the British small boats. However, there have been rogue operations inside Iran. And in such a case, they oftentimes end with the perpetrator getting executed. This was the case with the son-in-law of Ayatollah Khomeini's deputy Grand Ayatollah Ali Montazeri. His son-in-law, Mehdi Hashemi, kidnapped the Syrian charge d'affaires. It was quite an effective operation. He also plotted an operation against Saudi Arabia, neither of which Khomeini wanted. Long story short, Mehdi Hashemi, despite his political connections, ended up before a firing squad. And many Iranians believe that they can trace the son of Ayatollah Khomeini's death, Ahmed Khomeini, to a rogue operation involving an IRGC missile base in Khorramshahr. But I'll step back and say, well, who cares whether it's a rogue operation or not when it comes to U.S. security concerns with regard to Iran? As Iran develops and approaches a threshold of having a nuclear weapons capability, it should concern us a great deal if they still don't have adequate command and control over their system. And certainly, one of our big intelligence failures in the United States is as much as we talk about and give descriptions of the Iranian political spectrum, reformers here, hardliners there, pragmatists somewhere in the middle, we don't have an idea of the same sort of factionalization within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. It would be pretty safe to assume that if Iran develops a nuclear weapons capability, it will be someone within the IRGC that has the command and control over that. And if we don't know what specific factions think within that big black box, that should give us quite a reason for concern. This leads to issues such as strategies, military strategies, given the way Iran acts and given its acceleration towards nuclear technology. Containment and deterrence are military strategies. They're not rhetorical strategies, and oftentimes many people in the United States don't treat them as military strategies. There's a danger, and perhaps one of the reasons that some in Iran felt they could plan this terrorist attack in Washington, D.C., there's a danger if they don't take our red line seriously. And there's every indication that they don't. I had some poor intern go back and look at voided red lines from the Bush administration and Obama administration vis-a-vis Iran. They counted 28 of them. Things like, if Iran doesn't cease suspending uranium enrichment by the time of the G20 summit in Pittsburgh, then there will be crippling sanctions, and months go by, nothing. That only emboldens people in Iran who believe, quote unquote, that America is a paper tiger. What is containment, for example? Loosely put, it's the ability of all the countries in the region to wage war independently with Iran for 3 or 4 days before the cavalry can come in. Deterrence, bluntly put, is the willingness to kill millions of Iranians in a retaliatory strike. And there's no indication that the United States is prepared for either. Certainly during the Democratic primary debate with Senator Clinton, Senator Biden, and Senator Obama, when Senator Clinton said if Iran ever used nuclear weapons, we would annihilate them, both Biden and Obama jumped down our throat, which at the very least suggests that the Iranians don't believe we're serious with regard to deterrence. But let's look at deterrence for a second. What's the nightmare scenario? And this goes into the issue of rogue elements, or at least extreme elements, with their finger on the button. Suppose we know for a fact that most Iranians don't particularly care for their system. Well, what happens if you have a situation like in 2009, where you have an uprising, but instead of the Iranians being able to put it down, you have a situation like what occurred in 1989 in Romania, where some of the security forces join in, and pretty soon you realize that it's only a matter of time before this regime crumbles, maybe 6 hours, maybe 1 hour. Well, if you have a very radical element to the IRGC, which has its fingers in the button, then can deterrence work? A lot of people will talk about the Iranian regime not being suicidal. But if there's going to be regime change in an hour anyway, what's to stop this element from operating or acting out its ideological fantasy and either dropping a bomb on Saudi Arabia, Israel, or U.S. forces in the region? Would we really be willing to retaliate against a regime that has already had regime change? I'll bet you the answer to that is no. And we're not going to gratuitously kill 20 million Iranians when they've already overthrown the regime. There's, by the way, before Gaddafi fell, some of his forces had fired missiles on Misrata after the rebels took the city, after the rebels took Tripoli. Well, that should be a wake-up call, too. If they can fire Scuds at Misrata just out of spite, what should happen if you actually do have a regime change in progress in Iran? What would this element of the IRGC do? Now, there are options which we can undertake. I'm not a big fan of the United Nations. I don't think it's a model for effectiveness. However, a lot of people will say we have to act multilaterally, otherwise U.S. business is going to be hurt. This isn't quite the case. When people talk about sanctioning Iran's central bank, we don't need to do that under the United Nations system. According to people in the Treasury Department, we have the ability to do that through certain clauses of the Patriot Act. We've used this power against North Korea on 7 different occasions, and many of our European allies will actually yell at us and say the fact that we haven't used our unilateral power to designate under the Patriot Act against Iran, where we have against North Korea, shows that we lack a seriousness, and they cite it as hypocrisy whenever we ask the Europeans to take a harder line with regard to Iran and sanctions. Now, a lot of people will complain that we should just have targeted sanctions in Iran. There's one reason why targeted sanctions don't work. If you read the Financial Times, or if you read the Iranian press even, there's a lot of discussion about privatization. Iran selling off its state industries, and at the same time, you have stories, again in the Financial Times, about how the Tehran Stock Exchange is booming. Here are the devil's in the details, though. When Iran privatizes, oftentimes what that means is taking a state-owned company, having an IPO on the Tehran Stock Exchange, but then when you look at who buys it, it oftentimes only has one bidder. and it's either a Revolutionary Guard-owned bank or a Revolutionary Guard-owned company, which basically means they're playing anti-sanctions three-card Monte, where they're able to play a shell game with companies and shift the companies involved in proliferation activities faster than the U.S. Treasury Department or the United Nations can designate. If we were able to go after the central bank directly, this would, in effect, void any transactions conducted in reals, whether any country wanted to or not. I mean, the Russians would have no choice, the Chinese would have no choice. It would just be a fact of life. They could choose between working with Iran and working with anyone else in the world. It's the way the financial system is constructed, people in the Treasury Department tell me. I should say some people worry that if we over-sanction Iran, there could be blowback. Most of the Iranians are pretty pro-Western when it comes to at least culture. But are we going to antagonize them by going too far with sanctions? And the answer there is no. Whenever there has been economic problems in Iran, the government has failed to convince the people that the outside is to blame. A couple of years ago, I think in winter of 2008, 2009, there was a brutal winter, and according to Iran's state press, the IRGC had to come out in 14 provinces in northern Iran because the price of bread in some cases increased 800%. They were blaming the government, they weren't blaming the Americans. And the goal I have is, given how Iran is a tinderbox, the question is whether the government is quicker at putting out the sparks than the opposition is at creating that wildfire. Eventually there will be a wildfire. There will be no muddle-through reform in Iran. Most of the reformists are quite apathetic, and during Q&A I can tell some jokes about that I hear from Iranians. Now, a couple other issues which we need to consider. There should be a strategy with regard, whenever I talk at military academies, the military oftentimes uses the so-called DIME paradigm. Every comprehensive strategy should have a diplomatic, informational, military, and economic component. If you, as Frank Gaffney said on the radio, if you take the military out of that, you just have a die strategy. But in this case, I want to talk about information for a bit. Talk about Voice of America Persian service. And I'm winding down here because I don't want to rabbit on too long. In this case, the new head of Voice of America Persian service is a State Department officer, a Foreign Service officer named Ramin Asgard. Ramin may be an honorable man, but there seems to be a lack of strategy and a lack of purpose. And oftentimes I see this whenever I hear American broadcasters speak. Is our goal to just provide news and get the greatest share of audience, for example with Radio Sawa and the music and so forth? Is our goal to build credibility for ourselves by criticizing the United States? Or is our goal to have a litmus test such as, what is it that an Iranian journalist inside Iran can't talk about and can't publish, and focus on that? Issues of corruption, for example. And it seems that we don't have that focus. I find it very worrying that in the last couple weeks, two of the hosts and commentators at Voice of America Persian Service, who tend to be much more antagonistic towards the Islamic Republic, were fired, and now the line seems to be much more pro-engagement. Now, the other point I would make, and this is a challenge that we can make to people on the left, we missed, during the Bush administration, our Lech Walesa Gdansk moment in Iran, referring to solidarity in Poland in 1981. Throughout the Middle East, you don't have NGOs, you have gongos, government-operated NGOs. And most unions are under the control of the Ministry of Labor. In 2005, the Iranian bus drivers, and they were later joined by the sugarcane workers, formed the first independent trade unions. If we want to create that spark that will bring change to Iran without overt military action, then it would be useful to challenge the Europeans, to challenge the Social Democrats and so forth, to support and to provide funds, strike funds, for example, for independent trade unions in Iran. The last thing I want to say is, and this may seem obvious to this group, we should do absolutely nothing which throws a lifeline to a failing regime. We should do nothing, no strategy that preserves the Islamic Republic. It doesn't matter if we want an engagement process to continue. The Chicken Kiev speech was kind of stupid back at the end of the George H.W. Bush administration. We should have no equivalent when it comes to Iran today. Now, there's a reason why, in the minds of our professors, our academics, and many of our diplomats, that it makes sense to preserve the Islamic Republic. Many, and this goes into just academic historiography, so I'm going to put on my nerd hat, and then I'm going to shut up. Most of the books written about Iran that are still used as textbooks in the United States, or for Middle East history classes and so forth, were commissioned in 1979, 1980, and they appeared in 1981 when the Islamic Revolution shocked everyone. Books, for example, by Nikki Keddie or Ervand Abrahamian and so forth, for those of you that focus on Middle East type stuff. They were challenged by their publishers, explain what happened. And so they looked back with the benefit of hindsight and explained all the warning signs which Western analysts had missed, and came to the conclusion about how the Islamic Revolution was really the apex of political evolution inside Iran. It was an anomaly. The reason why the revolution happened had a lot to do with just plain bad luck. There's many points in time where it could have been reversed, or little things in history that, had we known that the Shah had terminal cancer in 1974, perhaps we could have acted differently. But because of the historiography, many people have come into the State Department believing, or into the analytical wing of the CIA, just assuming that the Islamic Republic has always been there and always will be, and there's no way that we should see that point. I mean, ultimately, the problem isn't Iran's nuclear weapons, it's the regime that would yield them, and with that, let me yield the floor.